Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this new webinar hosted by the IIOP. It's a beautiful evening outside, so thank you to all of you who have decided to stay inside and learn more on how to talk about suicide. For those who would like to rewatch the webinar or couldn't make the webinar, a recording will be available to watch on demand. My name is Mariangela Toma, and I'm a pharmacist working as a medical advisor, hematology at Pfizer, and I'm delighted to facilitate this webinar this evening. Before we move to our speakers, just a bit of domestics. So, as I said, the webinar will be recorded. The microphones are muted. You can decide if you want your videos on or off. But if you experience any problems with connectivity, please turn off the video. If difficulty with sound, first of all, check that the sound speaker is not muted or turned down on your computer or phone. And then if still doesn't work, try logging off and on again. Use the chat function for questions or comments. That it's already open. You can use it straight away. We may use some anonymized information from the webinar, and then there will be a completion of a post-webinar survey, and the link it's already will be in the chat soon. So today we are joined by two great speakers, Ailish O'Neill, National Education and Training Manager, National Office for Suicide Prevention, and John Kennedy, Consultant Suicide Prevention Trainer. So Ailish, John, thank you so much for being here with us tonight, and I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Great. So thanks so much, everybody, for joining. And I suppose just to echo what Mariangela said there, it is a lovely sunny evening. So we do appreciate you taking the time to log in. And I appreciate other people will be watching back on the webinar. So delighted to have you all here this evening. So if you just want to go forward there, Grace. So the title of our presentation this evening is How to Talk About Suicide. So I suppose just to preface and to say that, this evening we are talking about suicide and it is sensitive. It's a very sensitive topic. You may find that it triggers you in ways that you hadn't perceived. So you may find it upsetting. You could overly identify it with it, be it on a personal or a professional level, or it just may impact on you in different ways. So I suppose with that in mind, I just encourage you just to be mindful of your own self-care needs if you're watching this live or if you're watching it back, and just to take a break or to opt out of the presentation if you feel you need to do so, and to link in with a colleague afterward if anything comes up with for you, or link in with a friend. And equally, John's contact details and my contact details will be at the end of the presentation, and we're very happy to speak to anybody. Just at the bottom of the slide there, you'll see I've signposted to yourmentalhealth.ie, and we'll speak to that later in the presentation. But that is a really, really useful resource for you to become familiar with, because it does signpost and it does detail a whole range of supports and services that are available and that are available in different areas as well. Thanks, Grace. So when we present, or when we have the opportunity to present on the topic of suicide, it's really important we always take the opportunity to talk about the importance of language. And language really has that ability to heal, or equally it has that ability to harm. So we would really encourage you just to become aware and to always use sensitive and non-stigmatizing language when discussing suicide and self-harm. So we're all human. We're all shaped by the experiences that we've had. So we'd really encourage you that when you are leaning into this space or working in this space, to remain non-judgmental and to try not to make assumptions about other people. We'd also really encourage you not to identify a person solely by their mental health difficulty, and never to use a suicide as a noun to describe a person. And also, I suppose, to become aware and tune into the language that we use, so that we would encourage you to use neutral and simple terms. So very often in our narrative, and without even thinking, you'll hear we'll use the language that someone committed suicide. So we'd really encourage you to move away from that language and to say somebody died by suicide or somebody ended his or her own life. And I suppose the reason for that or the context for that is in 1993, which is not that long ago, suicide was decriminalized. And when we say committed suicide, it really harps back to that association that suicide was a crime and also it was seen as a mortal sin in the eyes of the Catholic Church. And just to give you share an anecdote with you, I remember being at a conference, and as I said, we always speak to the importance of language. And I remember speaking to an older gentleman, and he shared with me how his son had died by suicide in the late 1980s. And so often, people would say committed suicide, and it would have that real visceral reaction for him when he would be taken back to that, I suppose, struggle, that real internal struggle he and his family had at the time, trying to rationalize this concept that his son had committed a crime or that his son had committed a mortal sin. So it's really to help us to move away from that association. We would encourage you to say a death by suicide rather than a successful or a completed suicide. We would say that somebody had an attempt on his or her life rather than an unsuccessful suicide or a suicide attempt. And we've moved away from using the language of deliberate self-harm to the language of self-harm. So you can move on there, Grace. So to set our work in context and to set suicide prevention training in that strategic context. So we'll all be aware and we know that suicide is complex and so are its solutions. And there is no panacea. And suicide prevention training is one of the tools that we use in our national suicide prevention strategy to help us achieve our objectives and to help us reduce suicide rates. You'll see here on the left-hand side of the screen, I've shared a screen image of our national education and training plan. So all of our suicide prevention education and training objectives are named within that plan, and we update that plan on an annual basis. So again, I'd really encourage you if you're on this call and you see particular gaps or you see particular potential that could be addressed, that you would link in with us and we can look to work collaboratively with you on that. So when we think about suicide prevention gatekeeper training, so what are the principles that underpin it? How does it work? So when people are thinking about suicide, they can send out what we call invitations for help. And unless we're perhaps aware or tuned into what those invitations might be, we can tend to do what we say, we can miss them. We may dismiss them and not take them as serious, or we may avoid them. We may avoid them out of fear of saying or doing the wrong thing. So what our suicide prevention gatekeeper training does is it challenges that fear and that anxiety. And what it does, it's effective in improving participants' knowledge, their skills, and their confidence and their capacity to be able to recognize and subsequently intervene if they're concerned that somebody is in suicidal distress. Also, I think, and this is the feedback that we get from people who attend our suicide prevention training, is that in our training rooms, they're safe spaces. They're safe spaces for people to have a conversation on the topic of suicide, which isn't something that we typically do. So they're safe spaces to allow people to explore and to challenge, I think, perhaps their preconceptions, their ideas, and also the myths that exist around suicide. Next slide, Grace. And I suppose one of the most prevalent myths and one of the ones that we really want to challenge here this evening is the idea that if I ask about suicide, that I will put the idea of suicide in a person's head. And what we know is that the counter of that is true. So when we talk about suicide and when we talk about suicide directly, we are giving individuals or the person who may be thinking about suicide, we're giving them permission to tell us how they feel, to seek help, and we're breaking down the stigma. And one of the most important things that we can do is ask clearly and directly, are you thinking about suicide? Are you thinking about ending your life? And John will speak to that shortly as he goes through the steps. Because if somebody is thinking about suicide, that can be a very lonely and a very isolating place. So when you speak directly and you use that language, what you're doing is you're bridging that communication gap, and you're opening up that conversation and inviting somebody to tell us about what it is that they're experiencing. So to walk us through those steps, I'm now going to hand you over to John, who is going to present a scenario and work through the steps to take with that particular person. So you can go to the next slide, Grace.
Thanks, Ailish. Thanks for that introduction, and for those general pointers, just setting the context of suicide in Ireland. Good evening, everybody. John Kennedy is my name. Essentially, I've been doing training and education around suicide, self-harm for over 22 years now, both here and abroad. Really lovely to be here with you tonight. Thank you to the Irish Institute of Pharmacy and to the National Office for inviting me here. I really hope that you find our presentation helpful tonight. So essentially, our plan is to support you tonight in this discussion with 4 simple steps that would allow you, I suppose, to be more comfortable and more confident in knowing how to respond to someone who's thinking about suicide, because it can be a very challenging and emotional event or situation to deal with. So to give us a starting point, so to speak, as Ailish said, we're going to use a case study. And it's there on the screen in front of you. I hope you can all see that. So it's a client or patient presenting in the pharmacy, Yurgov, 28-year-old Ukrainian refugee, who regularly presents to your pharmacy and to manage his type 1 diabetes and depression. English is not his first language, so he struggles to understand your conversation at times. He's prescribed short-acting and long-acting insulin, has good management of his blood sugars, and takes sertraline 100 milligrams daily for depression. So he's here. His context is he's here in Ireland with his sister. They've recently lost their brother to the conflict, and their parents remain stuck in the conflict zone. He's also a heavy drinker on most evenings, doesn't smoke, currently living in a hotel in the town that has been converted to support refugees, sharing a bedroom with 2 other men and a bathroom with 10 other Ukrainians. He's identified work in a local restaurant, but is a builder by trade. And on this particular day, he presents to you very upset, practically inconsolable. Translation of what he's saying is challenging, but a number of things are evident. He's indicating a wish to die, and he's also talking about going to the river and hopes to quick end to his turmoil. So, if next slide, please, Grace. So just before we get into those 4 steps that I mentioned, so we'll use the 4 steps, and as we move to the steps, we'll use the case study as a way of contextualizing how we might move to those steps. But just a couple of general comments about suicide before we get into the steps of suicide and how you might respond. It's really important. It can be really frightening. Still, even after 22 years, talking about it, it can still feel frightening or thinking about dealing with it. So it's important to remember that for everybody, for you, the person who's maybe trying to help, for the person with thoughts themselves, for family, friends, anybody associated in the situation. Sometimes it can be very hard to understand what they're going through. It doesn't always feel logical or make sense. And another strong feeling you can have is, and hopefully tonight may give you some comfort or a sense of confidence around this one, is feeling uncertain as to, well, what can I do to help? How can I help this person who presents in front of me who's thinking of suicide? So a couple of kind of background things to keep kind of clear in your mind are, most deaths by suicide are very much preventable. The bottom line is there's no one born who wants to die. most people don't want to die. So the fact is, if someone presents to you and they start talking about suicide, you know, someone who's thinking about suicide, it's not that they want to die, rather it's that they want to live. They're finding it hard to live. So it's not so much that they want to die, but rather that they're finding it really hard to live. And they're two very different scripts to prescribe for. So I find that comforting, knowing, listen, you know, if there's somebody in front of me and they're thinking about suicide, I'm having that conversation. Well, I know that this person in front of me, it's not that they want to die, rather that they're finding it hard to live. Generally, someone who's thinking of suicide is in a lot of emotional pain. And the other good news is that, you know, if we give a person a chance to feel listened to, 9 times out of 10, a person can actually talk themselves out of suicide. They'll find their own way forward, because the bottom line is, behind it all, people want to live, not die. And I suppose the reason that we're all on this call tonight is suicide is everyone's business. We can all play a role in an appropriate and safe way and comfortable way to respond to the possibility of suicide. So next slide, please, Grace. So as I said, we're going to walk through 4 different steps that will help you, well, I hope that will help you feel more comfortable, more confident about dealing with suicide. The acronym to help remember it easily is CALM, C-A-L-M. So the C is for the first step, which is to connect with the person. The second letter A is for ask, to ask them about suicide. Your third step is L, to listen. And then fourth and last step is M, to make a plan to keep them safe. And remember, our main aim is to help the person to remain safe and that they get the help they need. We are not 100% responsible for keeping this person alive. So if you go to the next slide, please. That first step, the C, to connect, is to try and connect with what's going on with the person and the things that you might notice. And, you know, there are 4 really clever ways that human beings who are in distress let other human beings know that. They let you know by their behavior, change in the behavior, or how they are physically, a change in their feelings, or also maybe how they're thinking. I suppose the good news here for this first step, you know, one of your strongest competencies or skill sets is detail. You do detail. That's what you're best at, and you have to get it right. So, you know, focus on the detail. Pay attention to what you see, to what you hear, to what you sense, and what you learn from the client or the patient coming into you. You know, notice their behavior, what's going on for them physically, in terms of how they might be feeling and how they might be thinking. And I suppose in the context of our case study, just to, I suppose, try and make this step come alive, you know, you focusing on the detail, what will you have noticed? Well, you'll have noticed that the person's maybe anxious, agitated. It says that they were very upset, inconsolable. What do we know about them? You know, they're presenting with depression. They are have gone through a lot of loss, maybe feeling alone, socially, maybe not in the best context. What have they been saying? They've been talking about not being able to live, and maybe talking about maybe going to the river. So that's your first step in terms of calm, the C step, which is to connect and to pay attention to the detail that's happening in front of you. The behavior that you might notice, what's going on for the person physically, how they might be feeling, and how they might be thinking. So if any of that detail that I've just summarized there, and if you're with that person, if anything that you see, anything that you hear, anything that you sense, anything that you notice about the person, if any of that, if all of it, if one piece of it, it might be the way even somebody says something, if any of that you know, if you find your intuition or your gut saying to you, this sounds more serious, or that sounds, what they just said there sounds serious, or it might be even the way that they said it, or it might be just a combination of things, you know, that you might be getting a gradual sense of, you know, there might be a light bulb going off in you saying, I think this is more serious. That's your prompt to move to your next step, which is the A step. And again, good news here, because it's a step that is high guidance. It's about, you know, having a straight conversation. And if you want to go to the next step, just to summarize there on the connect step, you know, anything that when you do notice those things, maybe let the person know, give recognition to the things you've seen or heard or sensed or learned, and let them know that you're concerned, or you might sounds like you're going through a really tough time. And then that allows you to move to your next step. If you just click on the slide there. And that's the A for ask step. So if anything of what you see here or sense or learn suggests a possibility of suicide or feels more serious, your next best practice step is to ask clearly and directly. So it's a clear and direct conversation. And I suppose it's really important for us, you know, sometimes we can feel anxious about maybe asking this question, because it's not the easiest of questions to ask somebody. But remember, we don't ask out of the blue, because, you know, you have real reasons for asking your question. So in the context of our scenario with Yurgov, our Ukrainian client who's come into the pharmacy, you know, we can say to him, you know, Yurgov, I'm really concerned about you. You know, you seem really upset. You're talking about feeling very alone. You've had loss in your family. You know, your parents, you're not able to be with them. You're feeling really alone and very, very upset. And I've heard you saying things like that. You know, sometimes you want to die and you're thinking about going to the river. Sometimes when people are saying those things and thinking those things, they can be thinking about suicide. Are you thinking about suicide? So you link, you know, what you've noticed to asking your question. You know, by asking the question, you let the person know that it's okay for them to talk about suicide. By asking the question, you're acknowledging their distress and you give them an opportunity to talk about what's happening. And if their answer is yes, try not to panic. You know, if they do say yes, well, I mean, on one level, it's celebratory. You know, it's a time to celebrate because your intuition was right. You know, what you noticed was connected with suicide, and you did the right thing in asking. And it's really important. Just two other things that are really important about asking about suicide. If you ask about suicide and they answer, yes, I am thinking of suicide. And, you know, if you ask about suicide and the person says, well, you know, things are bad, John, but, you know, not that bad. I'm not thinking about suicide. In both cases, you have done absolutely the right thing. You've done international best practice. So it's a clarifying question. We don't know whether the person's thinking about suicide or not. So it's about clarifying whether it is or is, you know, anything that you've seen or heard or sensed or learned about this person, if that is connected to suicide. That's what this question is about. And you always ask it clearly and directly. And Ailish referred to that earlier, you know, about being, you know, important. It's really important how we ask about suicide and the language we use around suicide. So just the next slide there. So once you've asked about suicide, it's, I suppose, you know, if the person says yes, try not to panic. And the other thing about asking about suicide is, you know, some of you might be thinking there, well, from that scenario that we read at the beginning, the case study that we're doing, you know, the person said, like, you know, they were thinking of going to the river, and kind of assume that it's about suicide. It's really, really important in a situation like that that you always ask clearly and directly about suicide, because you just don't know. And It's really helpful for the person with thoughts of suicide to hear you asking clearly and directly. It's really important for you to hear yourself asking that question, so that both of you, the helper and the person helping and the person with thoughts of suicide, can both nod your heads and say, okay, we're agreed, we need to talk about suicide. So never take that for granted. Always based on the things that you've seen, heard, sensed, or learned, ask clearly and directly about suicide. So if they do say yes, two things: try not to panic, because there's at least another 2 steps that you can do to fall back on. When the person says that they're thinking about suicide, yes, I am thinking about suicide, try and just pause for a second, take a deep breath, and say something like, so you're thinking about suicide. That must be really difficult. Help me to understand that. I'm listening. And then let them talk. It might be, in terms of working at the pharmacy, the context might be that maybe you can bring it into a quieter place, or to a place there where it's easier to talk to them, or easier for them to talk. But that's your next step, to listen to them without judgment or without blame. And the best way to listen really is for us to say very little or nothing at all. Just invite them, say, help me understand why you're thinking about suicide and why now. And they will be just delighted to get that opportunity to talk about why suicide and why now for them. Try to avoid responses, as the slide says there, that seem to reject what they're feeling. Lessen how they feel, or try to change their view of their situation. And there's some examples of things down there not to say. And I mean, these are not in any way to kind of say that you're a bad person if you say these things. These are things that we often will say through anxiety, or through misunderstanding, or lack of understanding around how to deal with suicide. So things like, it's not that bad, or things will get better, or pull yourself together. These are really not helpful statements. Really what you want to get in this L step, once you know that it's about suicide, is that you want to give the person a chance to say what it's like for them to be thinking about suicide, and get a chance to feel listened to and understood. Because the more that they feel listened to and understood, is a better chance of them wanting to live, that their life side will come through, and that they'll get a sense of maybe there's a way forward. Often when they get listened to, they'll mention family, friends, things that are good in their life. And these are things that we can use then in our last step, which is the K step. So if you want to move on to that next slide. And just to finish off on the listening step, there's some examples of things to show that you've been really listening. Sounds like you're dealing with a lot at the moment. You're going through a really tough time. I'm sorry to hear you're feeling like this right now. Can you tell me more about what's going on for you? Or you might summarize, in terms of our friend Yorgov in our case study. You might say something like, okay, I understand now, Yorgov. You've been going through a really difficult time. You're missing your family who are stranded in Ukraine. You've lost a brother through the conflict. You're feeling depressed yourself, isolated. You're drinking quite a lot in the evening time. And you've been thinking about maybe going to the river to end your turmoil. I understand now why you're thinking about suicide. So that brings us to our last step. So our last step then is the M step. M step is to make a plan. So what do we know so far? We know we've connected with Yorgov and the things that we've noticed about him. We are so concerned about what we've noticed that we've asked about suicide. We've tried to listen to what's going on for him, so that we could understand why he was thinking of suicide. And then the last step then is to make a plan. So really, sometimes at this stage, the person may already have mentioned things that they want to stay alive for in the first place, like their family or their friends. So, say to the person, this is serious, I'm concerned about you. We need to do something now. We need to make a plan that keeps you safe. A really important thing to feel at this stage is sometimes we can feel when, the person's with us, is that we have to turn into a magician and sort out all their problems. Not so. I mean, our only responsibility is to do something that keeps the person really safe from suicide. So, in terms of making that plan, one of the best places to start is with the person themselves and say, listen, I think we need to do something to keep you safe at this moment, to keep you safe from suicide. And I'm wondering, is there someone, like, in terms of making a plan, is there someone like the questions that are up there on the slide, who would you feel comfortable talking to about this? Or who has helped you in the past? Or who would you like me to contact? So it might be a family member or a friend. Just the next slide there, Grace. So some general supports, just to in the context of making a plan, and I know Ailish kind of signposted it already. That website, www.yourmentalhealth.ie, and that's a really helpful website if you wanted to get just some general ideas around where you might get some help. So I know on that mentalhealth.ie, when you go into it, there's a link that you can click on, if it's really serious or if you need to get immediate help. And then there's another link into, trying to find services or supports, general ones that might be of help. So it really is a bit of homework to go in and have a look on that website and see all the different things that are there. I think it's called the urgent help link. And the second one is, where people can find help or support services. There's also a mention on that website there, kind of bereavement supports or supports for carers and families, counselling services. You can also see on the slide here that, the GP is often one of the best places to get support for the person who's thinking about suicide, to either bring them to their GP or to get them to go to their GP. There's also the out of hours GP service. Some of you may be aware of what's called the SCAN service, which is SCAN, Suicide Assessment Crisis Assessment Nurse. You'll find that in some of the primary care in some of the health areas around the country. And then there's some other ones there, the tech support service, and there's also the Samaritans, which you probably are already familiar with. Just the next slide there, please, Grace. Pieta House is one that you've probably heard a lot about. They have a 24-hour helpline and crisis service. There's the number for it there. They also have counselling services for people, free counselling services that they offer to people who are thinking about suicide. Then there's the resource officers for suicide prevention. So in each of the 9 health areas around the country, there's a dedicated resource officer in the health service dealing with suicide prevention. So it might be worth your while getting in touch with the local resource office in your area. You can find their details on that link there, and to get in touch with them and to see, okay, what are the services that are in our actual area, what might be available for us to use, to get in touch with them. So getting back to our case study then, and if you just go to the next slide there. Just hold there 1 second. I have a dog here who needs to be kept safe. 1 second. I'm back. He was crying at the door there, so I had to leave him in. So yeah, so getting back to our case study there, what can we do with Yorgos at this stage? So he's presented that we now know he's thinking about suicide. We've listened to him and we've tried to agree with him that we need to make a plan to keep him safe. So you could, as I suggested, as a first step, talk to him. Often the person who's thinking about suicide, often they're the wisest person in the room in terms of getting help. So you might say to him, you know, is there someone who we can contact for you? Have you a family member? So maybe to contact his sister, was mentioned in the case study. And maybe she might be able to come to the pharmacy and to collect him and to bring him to further help. It might be, that we have an agreement with the local GP that if we have somebody who is really in distress and maybe thinking about suicide, that maybe there's an option of bringing them to a GP, our local GP. I suppose what you're trying to do is to any way that we can keep this person safe, and obviously, if Yorgos, was to get really upset, if it was to turn into an emergency situation where Yorgos stormed out of your pharmacy, well then, that's an emergency situation. You're no longer in a position to help keep them safe. And the only thing you can do really is to contact emergency services. But there's lots we can do. I mean, that's the absolute worst case scenario. We can check in with him about possible supports, his family or friends. We can let him know of other supports that might be of help to him that I just mentioned there now. I suppose another small piece of helpful homework that maybe would be really helpful for use teams, pharmacies, the teams that you work with is, to sit down with the team and to decide, okay, what would keeping a person safe look like in our situation? What are the resources that are available to us? What are the things that are possible? What are the things that we can do? And to sit down and have a conversation about that, and decide what the steps are going to be, who's going to be the resource, what's the telephone number, where's the place we're going to bring them to decide all that. Better again to put it down on paper so that everybody is clear on what the plan is if that emergency situation was to happen. And if someone was to present with suicide, and to include, of course, that in an emergency situation, that you would call if someone was to leave the pharmacy and there was no more that you could do, that you would contact the emergency services. Having that protocol or policy and putting that together in your team is an act of self-care in that it, at least you can be comfortable and clear. Okay, I know what it is we will do to keep a person safe and what has been agreed across the team to help keep this person safe. I suppose one last thing to say to you then is that there are 4 steps. It's really important. That can be quite an upsetting situation to find yourself in, and we all have different levels of resilience. But it's really maybe part of your protocol would be to either debrief with a colleague or to your manager after an event like that, so that you get looked after yourself, because it can be quite a challenging situation to have to go through those 4 steps that I just walked through. So I hope those steps were helpful and clear, and I'm going to hand back to Ailish just to bring a close to and signpost you to some important things.
That's great. Excuse me. Thanks a million, John, and thanks for that very comprehensive overview. And John has so much experience, and I've worked with John since I've came into post in the National Office for Suicide Prevention, and he is a mine of information. So really appreciate you taking the time to support us on the webinar tonight, John. Just to pick up maybe on one or two points mentioned there by John. So John talked about, well, what perhaps is your policy or what perhaps could be your protocol in your particular setting or in your workplace. So one of the documents, and we'll add this to the resources post the webinar, it's just not published yet. One of the resources that we're working on at the moment is Suicide Prevention in the Workplace, a guide for employers, where we'll be actually providing a template to say, well, what would a policy look like in your setting on suicide prevention? What would a protocol look like on suicide prevention in your setting? So again, it's taking those key steps that John has spoken about, but mapping them and mapping them out so people are very clear around what it is their role is and what it is that they can do. So I suppose just to maybe finish off, to echo and pick up what John has said, is we do all have a role to play in suicide prevention, but it's about playing that role in a very safe and appropriate way. And what we want to do is we want to be able to support you to lean into the space and to build your capacity. So in our education and training plan, what we have done is we have mapped what we call 5 levels of suicide prevention gatekeepers. So from level 3 up to level 4 and 5, that's who we would typically deem to be designated gatekeepers. And I suppose in your role, you'll decide whether or not you are a designated gatekeeper. So designated gatekeepers are individuals who, through the course of their work, are likely to come across people in suicidal distress. And for people who work in that space, we would really encourage and signpost people towards our assist training, which is a 2-day suicide intervention training, which is really about so picking up on the steps that John has taken, but looking at much more of a deeper intervention with the person and also looking at safety planning around how to keep that person safe. On level 1 and level 2, this is what we would term our emergent gatekeepers. So this is everybody, essentially. This is all of us going through our daily lives. So if we become alert to any of those risk factors, those signs that John spoke to earlier, what are the steps that we take and how do we lean into this space? So if you want to go to the next slide there, please, Grace. So I suppose the call to action, or really what we would encourage you to do as a first step tonight, is last year we launched an online suicide prevention training program here. Let's talk about suicide. And that's a 60-minute online self-directed training program that you can undertake yourself. And what it does is it takes you through the steps that John has outlined, but it takes you through those steps in a little bit more detail. And it also signposts to key resources and to resources available by county. But one of the features that we have embedded in that training program is a recording function where people actually record themselves asking the question. So, are you thinking about suicide? Are you thinking about ending your life? Because again, I suppose to pick up on John's points, that is one of the most important steps that we can take, but also that can be one of the most scariest steps that we have to take because this isn't something that we regularly talk about or isn't something that it's not part of our narrative. So the feedback that we've gotten around that recording function is people have found it really, really useful because it gives them a safe space to practice saying the words. It gives them an opportunity to hear themselves back, and you can re-record yourselves as many times as you like, and it's not held on the system in any way, shape, or form. So that training program is available through the web link here. And also then I mentioned the assist training program. We have Safe Talk. So Safe Talk is probably more pitched at that emergent gatekeeper training. So that's a 3.5 hour face-to-face training program. And then I appreciate that there may be people on the call here who are interested or working in an area where they want more information on the topic of self-harm or perhaps on the topic of suicide bereavement. So we have 1-day training programs on understanding self-harm and a 1-day training program on suicide bereavement. So if you are working with people who've been bereaved by suicide, and both of those trainings can be facilitated either face-to-face or online, and all of those information can be found here at the training link. So if you want to go to the next slide there, Grace. So I suppose just to really say thank you so much for your time. It's a heavy subject, and it's really a very high level overview and a brief introduction to the steps to take and what to do. But hopefully it gives you some tangible tools to take away with you tonight. So thank you so much for your time. And I suppose if there are any questions, perhaps Mary Angela, or if we can open it up, or if you have any particular questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ailish and John. That was really, really good and comprehensive. There is one question here in the chat. Cecilia was asking if the slides were available after the webinar, especially the calm part. So the webinar is being recorded. So everybody who joined will join the talk will receive the recording, but also the recording will be available on the IIOP website. So yes, Cecilia, you can access the recording anytime. And if anybody has any other questions, please put them in the chat. Maybe I might kick off with a question myself. So in the case study, and we have been discussing a refugee who comes to a pharmacy. We are pharmacists, so we might be thinking about people, about customers coming to us. But we are also people ourselves. We have family, and we may have ourselves people around us with mental health difficulties. And maybe kids as well. So my question is, how seriously maybe, and how should we taking a child, a 7-year child, talking about life being difficult for them, and thinking to end, that would be better to end their lives. So first of all, should that be taken seriously? And then if it was to take seriously, what would the step be to help this child?
Do you want to take that, John?
I can try and respond to it. Yeah, it's a very difficult question, and unfortunately, we know that children as young as 7 can take their lives and have taken their lives by suicide. Which means we have to appreciate, hard and all as it is, that children do understand what suicide is about. So there's two things going on for me, really. One, in terms of responding to your question, one, you would still follow the steps that we went through tonight in terms of, being aware of whether it's a 7-year-old or a 70-year-old, their behavior, things that they might be saying, and feelings that you might be picking up, things that might be going on, life events that might be going on for them. And again, whether it's with the 7-year-old or 70-year-old, I mean, if anything, what they say, or if you're getting a sense, or your intuition is telling you this is more serious, don't take a chance on not asking. Ask about suicide. The second thing is about language, really. So, you'll know your child, or maybe the family member, hopefully, and you may know the language. Not every 7-year-old will understand the same language, or they may use different language to describe things. But I suppose what you're trying to do is, one, use the steps or the skills that we've just outlined to walk through, and they remain the same. And two, to use language that is maybe more helpful, more appropriate, or more relevant, so that the person is understanding, what we're talking to them about. When we ask them about suicide, when we're listening to them, when we're trying to connect with them, you would do the same things, but I suppose you would just be cognizant of language, and knowing that 7-year-old and how best to talk to them using the language that works best for them, but they still reflect doing the same 4 steps. In terms of where you might bring them, I mean, if it's not an emergency, I would say GP, a good GP is always a good starting point. Yeah. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Ailish.
I suppose the most important thing to say, it's always clarifying, isn't it, with the individual, be that with a child, what do we mean by suicide? So their understanding of what this means and allowing a conversation in an age appropriate way. But it is exactly as John said, it is taking through each of those steps. And I just see, Mary Angela, there is another question in there around suicide bereavement resources for children. So there is an excellent resource, and I'll post it up here. So Safe Harbor, it's an illustrated storybook, and we have 2 versions. So it's an illustrated storybook that talks about the journey of a young child who has in one instant they've lost their mum through suicide, and what that means, and talking to the child so they can understand and explain why it happened and how it happened, and what this means for you as a family. And similarly, we also have one for a child whose dad died by suicide. So Safe Harbor, it's the first of its kind, actually, internationally. It's the first of its kind in terms of that illustrated storybook, and using that medium to communicate and talk about suicide. So I think that would be a really useful resource for the person who asked that question. So I'm just going to post that there into the link for them as well.
Yes, thank you. So something else, I think, John, I think you already said that, but just to clarify if my understanding is correct. So we have this person coming to a pharmacy, and we try to go through the steps. How about if at some point this person doesn't want to engage anymore and runs away? I think you said about calling the emergency help. Is that what should be done, or is there anything else we should be doing?
Well, yeah, I mean, in any emergency situation, I mean, if somebody was to have a heart attack in our pharmacy or any place of work, you know, obviously you call the emergency services. So if you find yourself in a situation where, you know, you pharmacist are with somebody, you're talking to someone, they've told you that they're thinking about suicide and that they're serious about it, and if they very emotionally, if they run out of the pharmacy or whatever, well then you know you're no longer in a position to do anything to keep them safe from suicide. The only thing that you can do, and the only responsible thing you can do, is call emergency services and say, you know, and there's a person called Yorgov. He's 28 years of old. You can describe him, and you know he's come in. He's thinking about suicide, and he's after running out of the shop here, and he's after running in a certain direction. That's as much as you can do. Is try to engage emergency service who can take over and maybe might be able to do something in an emergency way to keep that person safe, because you can no longer do it.
Okay.
Yeah.
And after we went through the steps, and we made a plan, and we know that the person is hopefully safe with the plan, should we re-engage with the person, or we shouldn't?
Okay, well, I mean, there's that homework that I mentioned, you know, that to make clear in your protocol, you know, whether there's follow-up or not. you know, it's going to feel different in lots of situations. You know, if it's not within your pharmacy, and if it's with a family member or with a friend, you know, it might feel very natural and appropriate for you to do follow up and check in with the person and see if they're okay, and or see if there's anything else that we can do. But in a situation where, you know, as a professional, as a pharmacist, you know, and if you've done an intervention, and you know, you got the person to safety, you might not feel that it's appropriate to do that. So I think it's a case by case, and I think it's a very good question. I'm glad you asked it, and it might be part of, like, you know, what people might decide to do, you know, within their teams. Maybe make that one of the things that they consider. Do we do a follow up with a client if such a thing was to happen or not? Yeah.
Okay, just checking the chat. I don't see. I don't see any other questions. So, as I mentioned before, we really appreciate your feedback. There was a link in. There is now a link in the chat. If you can take the feedback through the link, and then there will also be a follow-up email later on with the recording as well and the link. So try to reflect on the impact of this learning, that this learning will have in your practice, and don't forget to record it in your CPD portfolio. In terms of next webinar, will be Wednesday, 30th of April at 8 p.m. and will be about medicine management program on update on continuous glucose monitoring systems in diabetes management. So with that, I would like to thank again Ailish and John for this incredible talk, comprehensive talk about suicide, how to talk about suicide. And I wish you a good night, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.